I sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table in the boardroom of Vance Corporation. The air in the room was sterile, smelling faintly of expensive leather and ozone from the copy machines down the hall. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, the Atlanta skyline gleamed under the harsh afternoon sun, but the temperature inside the room felt like dead winter. Across from me sat my eldest son, Richard. He was 42 years old, wearing a bespoke Tom Ford suit that cost more than the first car his father and I had ever owned. His face, usually a mask of practiced, arrogant confidence, was entirely drained of color. He looked like a little boy who had just been caught stealing from the collection plate. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I simply slid the heavy manila folder across the glossy surface of the table until it stopped right in front of his perfectly manicured hands. "Sign it, Richard," I said. He said. My voice was quiet, steady, and utterly foreign to him. "You are officially terminated from the position of Chief Executive Officer. You have exactly 10 minutes to clear out your desk, hand over your security badge, and leave my building." Richard stared at me, his eyes wide with a frantic mix of terror and disbelief. "Your building?" he finally choked out, his voice cracking. "Mom, you've lost your mind. You can't do this. I own this company. Dad left it to me." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in my lap. I looked at the man I had given birth to, the man I had rocked to sleep through endless nights, the man who had just spent the last 6 months trying to erase my existence. "No, Richard," I said softly, feeling a cold, unfamiliar power settling into my bones. "Your father just let you play in the sandbox, but I own the playground." To understand how a 68-year-old widow came to fire her own flesh and blood from a multi-million-dollar empire, we have to go back. Back to exactly 6 months ago. Back to the day I realized that the family I had sacrificed my entire youth to build viewed me as nothing more than a piece of broken, obsolete furniture. It was a Tuesday morning, raining that miserable, bone-chilling Atlanta rain that seems to wash the color out of everything. We were gathered in the downtown offices of Sterling and Hayes, the law firm that handled my late husband's estate. Thomas had died just a month prior, a massive heart attack that took him before his feet even hit the floor by his side of the bed. 40 years of marriage, gone in the span of a single skipped heartbeat. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, wearing my best black morning dress. My hands were trembling so badly I had to clasp them tightly over my purse to keep the clasp from rattling. I felt hollowed out, entirely unmoored. For 4 decades, I had been Mrs. Thomas Vance. Without him, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. But if I was drowning in grief, my children were certainly swimming in anticipation. Richard sat to my right, constantly checking the Rolex on his wrist. Next to him was his wife, Brittany. She was 38, thin as a whippet, wearing an inappropriately tight charcoal dress and scrolling through her phone with bored, tapping fingernails. She had the kind of polished, aggressive beauty common among the wealthy wives of the Buckhead Country Club, all sharp angles, filler, and ruthless ambition. On my left was my youngest, Harrison, 35 years old, smelling faintly of stale bourbon and expensive cologne, hiding his bloodshot eyes behind dark designer sunglasses indoors. He kept shifting in his seat, entirely detached from the reality of the room, anxious to get this over with so he could get back to whatever dark corner he was currently hiding in. Mr. Hayes, an older lawyer with a grave face, cleared his throat and began to read Thomas's last will and testament. I listened as the empire my husband and I had built from absolutely nothing was carved up and served on a silver platter. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table of our first cramped apartment, my fingers stained with ink from balancing the ledgers, while Thomas was out trying to secure loans in his beat-up Chevy. I had been the bookkeeper, the strategist, the one who found the tax loopholes and stretched every dollar until it screamed. But as the company grew, Thomas became the face of Vance Corp., and I retreated to the background. I raised the boys. I hosted the dinner parties. I became the invisible foundation upon which their glittering lives were built. To my eldest son, Richard Vance, the lawyer read, his voice droning on, I leave full ownership and executive control of Vance Corporation, including all subsidiary holdings, valued at approximately $30 million. Richard let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He didn't look at me. He didn't reach for my hand. He just sat back, a smug, satisfied smile spreading across his face. Brittany finally put her phone away, her eyes gleaming with dollar signs. To my youngest son, Harrison Vance, Mr. Hayes continued. I leave the portfolio of commercial real estate properties located in the metropolitan area to provide a steady income and foundation for his future. Harrison merely grunted, rubbing his temples as if the lawyer's voice was giving him a headache. I waited. My heart pounded against my ribs. $30 million to Richard, the commercial properties to Harrison. I waited to hear how the man I loved had ensured my safety, my comfort, my dignity in my twilight years. Mr. Hayes paused, shuffling a piece of paper. He looked up at me, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flash of profound pity in his eyes. It was a look that made my stomach drop into my shoes. "And to my wife, Margaret," the lawyer said, his tone softening slightly. "I leave the primary residence in Buckhead, a monthly living stipend of $3,000 drawn from the estate trust, and—" He reached under his desk and pulled out a worn, heavy wooden object. "This personal item, per Thomas's strict instructions." He slid the object across the polished desk. It was an old, scratched oak box, a recipe box, the exact same box my mother had given me on my wedding day, which had sat on my kitchen counter for 40 years. The silence in the room was absolute. I stared at the scarred wood, unable to process what was happening. $3,000 a month? In our neighborhood, that barely covered the property taxes and the utilities. No access to the main accounts. No shares in the company I had helped build. Just a house I couldn't afford to keep, a pittance of an allowance, and an old recipe box. I had been erased. Before I could even find my voice, a sharp, cruel sound broke the silence. It was Brittany. She was laughing. Not a full laugh, but a scoff. A harsh, mocking sound that echoed off the mahogany walls. "Well," Brittany said, adjusting the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, "I guess Thomas knew exactly where your talents lie, Maggie. Maybe Dad thought you needed to bake some more of those little apple pies to keep yourself busy in retirement. You'll have plenty of time for hobbies now." I looked at my daughter-in-law, feeling a hot flush of absolute humiliation burn the back of my neck. I waited for Richard to say something, to defend me, to tell his wife to shut her mouth and show some respect to his mother. Richard just cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable, but not angry. "Brittany, please," he muttered half-heartedly. Then he turned to the lawyer, instantly dismissing my public execution. "Mr. Hayes, how quickly can the transition of power at Vance Corp be legally finalized? I have some major restructuring plans I want to implement by the end of the quarter." Harrison stood up, tossing his sunglasses back onto his face. "If we're done here, I have somewhere to be. Wire the property deeds to my accountant." He walked out of the door without a single glance in my direction. No one asked if I was okay. No one offered to drive me home in the rain. They had gotten what they came for. The spoils of war had been divided, and the old queen had been exiled to the kitchen. I don't remember the drive back to the suburbs. I operated on pure, numbing shock. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the massive 6-bedroom colonial house, the silence of the place hit me like a physical blow. The house was immaculate, perfectly decorated, and entirely empty. It felt like a mausoleum. I walked into the grand kitchen with its marble countertops and stainless steel appliances. I set my purse down on the island. In my hands, I still clutched the old oak recipe box. For 40 years, I had been the good wife. I had forgiven Thomas's late nights, his missed anniversaries, his obsessive dedication to the company. I had defended him to our sons when he missed their baseball games. I had worn the pearls, smiled at the corporate galas, and kept my mouth shut. I had trusted him completely. I believed with every fiber of my being that we were a team. "Why, Tommy?" I whispered to the empty kitchen. My voice broke, fracturing into a sob. "Why did you do this to me? Why did you leave me to them?" The grief finally shattered the shock. My knees buckled and I sank to the cold hardwood floor. I wept with a ferocity that frightened me. I cried for my lost husband. I cried for the sons who looked at me like I was a burden. I cried for the terrifying reality of being 68 years old, financially dependent, and entirely alone in the world. In my despair, I threw the recipe box. I didn't mean to. It was a spasm of pure frustration. The heavy oak box hit the sharp corner of the marble island with a loud, violent crack before clattering onto the floor tiles. I gasped, instantly regretting it. It was the last thing my mother had given me. I crawled over to where it lay. The brass hinge had snapped, and the bottom panel of the box had completely shattered. But as I reached out to gather the pieces, I froze. The box didn't just break, it separated. There was a false bottom, a hidden compartment nearly an inch deep concealed beneath the wood where I had kept index cards for decades. My tears stopped instantly. My breath caught in my throat. Sitting in the hollow space of the broken wood was a small black velvet pouch, a silver USB flash drive, and a thick sealed envelope with my name written on it in Thomas's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. My hands trembled violently as I reached for the envelope. I tore it open. Inside were several pages of heavy legal paper and a handwritten letter clipped to the front. My dearest Maggie, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the reading of the will has taken place. I can only imagine the pain and humiliation you felt today. I know you think I have betrayed you. I know you think I left you with nothing while giving the boys the kingdom. For that pain, I will spend eternity begging for your forgiveness. But Maggie, my brilliant, beautiful girl, I needed them to believe they had won. I needed Richard and Harrison to show you their true colors when they thought you had no power. Because the truth is, Maggie, they have no idea who they are dealing with, and they have no idea what they actually inherited. I wiped my eyes, reading the words again to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My heart started to beat a frantic rhythm against my ribs. 30 years ago, when the company first took off, I made a decision I hid from everyone, even you, because I wanted to protect you from the liabilities of my aggressive expansions. I set up an irrevocable family trust. It is the ultimate holding company. It owns the patents, the land the buildings sit on, the operating licenses, and 100% of the voting shares of Vance Corporation. Richard thinks he inherited a $30 million empire today. What he inherited is a hollow shell, an operating company that leases its very existence from the trust. And Maggie, I am not the beneficiary of that trust. I never was. I turned to the second page, my eyes scanning the legal documents attached. The signatures, the notarized stamps, the irrefutable proof. You are the sole, irrevocable owner of the family trust. You have been for 30 years. The USB drive contains every password, every offshore account, every hidden asset I built. The velvet pouch holds the master key to the safety deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. Richard is weak, Maggie. He's arrogant and he's foolish. Over the last 2 years, I discovered he has been bleeding Vance Corp dry. The $30 million he thinks he has is built on a house of cards he created. Harrison is lost to his demons. I failed them as a father. I coddled them, and I created entitled men who do not respect the sweat it took to build this life. The total value of the trust is not $30 million. It is over $150 million. I dropped the letter. The paper fluttered to the kitchen floor. $150 million. The number echoed in the vast, empty kitchen. It was a number so large it didn't even sound real. It was generational wealth. It was absolute, world-shifting power. I picked the letter back up, my hands no longer shaking. A strange, terrifying calm was washing over me. I leave you this not just as an inheritance, Maggie, but as a weapon. You have the power to liquidate them. You have the power to fire them. You have the power to shut off the tap forever. I give you the crown, my love. Rule wisely, and show our boys the strength of the woman they dared to underestimate. Forever yours, Thomas. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the large bay windows. I looked at the broken pieces of the recipe box. I thought about Brittany's sneering laugh. I thought about Richard looking at his Rolex, annoyed that my public humiliation was taking up his valuable time. I thought about Harrison walking out the door without looking back. They thought I was an old, useless woman. They thought they could push me into a corner to quietly fade away on a miserable $3,000 a month while they plundered the empire I helped build. Slowly, I gathered the USB drive, the velvet pouch, and the documents. I stood up. My knees didn't ache. My back felt straight. I walked over to the kitchen sink, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw the gray hair. I saw the wrinkles etched around my eyes. But the woman looking back at me was no longer a grieving, helpless widow. The invisible wife was dead. The matriarch had just woken up, and my children had absolutely no idea the storm that was coming for them. The next morning, I didn't bother opening the blinds. I sat at my husband's heavy mahogany desk in his home office, a cup of black coffee turning cold beside me. The silver USB drive Thomas had hidden in the recipe box was plugged into my laptop. I am not a computer hacker. I still write my grocery lists on the backs of old envelopes, but I am meticulous, and Thomas had known that. The drive didn't require me to write complex code. It was a cleanly organized directory of our entire lives, protected by a single password. Our anniversary, June 14th. Typical Thomas. Sentimental even while orchestrating a corporate bloodbath. The first folder I opened was labeled simply, The Bleed. It contained the private financial ledgers of Vance Corporation for the past 3 years. As I started to read the spreadsheets, the muscles in my neck tightened. 30 years ago, I used to balance our books at the kitchen table using a cheap calculator and a number 2 pencil. I knew how to track a dollar. I knew how a healthy company breathed. Vance Corporation wasn't breathing. It was suffocating. Richard hadn't just mismanaged the company, he had pillaged it. He had taken out massive high-risk loans to fund a series of catastrophic commercial real estate ventures. When those ventures tanked, he didn't cut his losses. He doubled down. To cover the massive gaps in the payroll and vendor accounts, he had started siphoning cash from the company's emergency reserves. But it was the document dated 6 months ago that made my blood run absolutely cold. Richard had taken out a predatory loan from a ruthless private equity firm called Apex Capital Partners. It was a firm famous in Atlanta for vulture capitalism. They preyed on struggling companies, forced them into bankruptcy, and sold off the assets for parts. To secure the loan, Richard had put up Vance Corporation itself as collateral. He had bet the entire empire my husband and I built on a single, desperate roll of the dice, and he was losing. Default was imminent. But there was a fatal flaw in Richard's arrogant plan, a flaw he was entirely unaware of. You cannot mortgage a house you do not own. Because the irrevocable family trust held the actual ownership of the corporation, the collateral agreement Richard had signed with Apex Capital was legally worthless. The moment I chose to reveal the trust, Apex Capital couldn't touch the company, but Richard would go to federal prison for wire fraud and forging ownership documents. My own son had traded his integrity and his father's legacy to cover his own incompetence. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my hands into my temples. A headache was throbbing behind my eyes, dull and relentless. I wanted to call him. I wanted to scream at him, to ask him how he could be so stupid. But then I opened the second folder on the USB drive. It was labeled The Rats. During his final months, Thomas had realized the company's internal communications were compromised. Paranoid and desperate to find the leak, he had hired a private security firm to install monitoring software on all company-issued cell phones and laptops. That included Richard's phone, and it included the phone Richard paid for through the company for his wife, Brittany. Thomas had left me the portal access. With a trembling hand, I clicked the icon, logging into the live dashboard. The screen populated with text message transcripts and call logs. I felt a pang of guilt, a lingering maternal instinct telling me it was wrong to spy on my children. But that guilt evaporated the moment I clicked on a recorded audio file from a phone call Richard and Brittany had shared just 2 days after Thomas's funeral. The audio crackled, then Richard's voice filled the quiet office. "The real estate agent walked through the house today," Richard was saying, his tone clipped and stressed. "She says the Buckhead house can list for $3.5 million. In this market, we could close in 30 days. Finally, Brittany's voice sighed. It was the same bored, grating tone she had used when she mocked me with the recipe box. God knows we need the liquidity, Rick. Apex is breathing down our necks. But what about your mother? She's not just going to pack up and leave her precious house." "We're not giving her a choice," Richard replied coldly. "I've already spoken to Dr. Evans. He's a consultant who owes me a favor. For a $10,000 fee, he's willing to sign an affidavit stating Mom is showing rapid signs of early-onset Alzheimer's. He'll say she's a danger to herself living alone in a house that big." I stopped breathing. The office around me seemed to spin. "A medical proxy," Brittany said, sounding genuinely impressed. "Rick, that's brilliant. Once you have medical power of attorney, you control her assets. You can force the sale of the house." "Exactly. And we move her into Sunset Manor." My stomach violently rebelled. I clapped a hand over my mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. Sunset Manor wasn't a retirement community. It was a Medicaid-funded warehouse on the bleak outskirts of the city. It was the place where families dumped the elderly when they ran out of money and patience. It was notorious for understaffing, neglect, and the smell of bleach trying to mask the scent of decay. "Sunset?" Brittany laughed. "Isn't that a little Grim? Her country club friends will talk. Who cares if they talk? Richard snapped. It's cheap. Her $3,000 a month stipend will cover the shared room, and we won't have to subsidize her living expenses. I need the $3.5 million from the house sale to hold Apex off Brit. It's either Mom goes to a home, or we lose the country club, the cars, everything. She's an old woman. She won't even know what's going on half the time anyway. You're right, Brittany purred. We have to protect our family, babe. I'll call the movers. Have the doctor ready the paperwork by Friday. The recording clicked off. I sat frozen in the silence of my dead husband's office. The tears didn't come. I had cried all my tears the day before. What filled the hollow space in my chest now was something entirely different. It was a cold, dense, and absolute fury. My son wasn't just a bad businessman. He was a predator. He was willing to strip me of my dignity, my home, and my freedom, locking me in a sterile room to rot, just to buy himself a few more months of pretending to be a billionaire. I looked back at the screen. I wasn't done. The rage demanded more fuel. I began scrolling through Brittany's text messages. If Richard was the architect of my demise, Brittany was the eager contractor. But as I read through her encrypted messages, a different story began to unfold. There was a separate thread, hidden deep in an encrypted app, with a contact named Marcus. I didn't know a Marcus, but I quickly realized exactly who he was. Marcus was the senior director at Apex Capital Partners, the very vulture who held the fraudulent mortgage on our company. I clicked on a message sent by Brittany 3 weeks before Thomas died. Brittany, Thomas is fading fast. The doctors say a month, tops. Rick is a mess, completely dropping the ball on the Q3 reports. Marcus, let him panic. The weaker he is, the easier the takeover. Keep feeding me the internal board minutes, beautiful. Once Vance Corp defaults and we liquidate the assets, your payout is guaranteed. 20% of the net. Brittany, I can't wait. I'm so tired of this fake suburban wife routine. As soon as the ink dries on the bankruptcy, I'm filing for divorce. I'll take my half of whatever Rick manages to hide, plus your payout, and we are on a beach in St. Bart's by Christmas. Miss your hands on me. Marcus, soon, baby. Let the idiot husband dig his own grave. I pushed my chair back from the desk, standing up so fast the chair tipped over and crashed onto the hardwood floor. I paced the length of the office, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles a minute. The betrayal was so deep, so multi-layered, it was almost hard to comprehend. Richard was betraying me to save his company, and Brittany was betraying Richard to steal the scraps and run off with the man destroying him. They were a nest of vipers, entirely consumed by greed. For 40 years I had hosted Thanksgiving dinners for these people. I had bought Brittany $1,000 cashmere sweaters for her birthdays while she smiled to my face and plotted to dump me in a squalid nursing home. I had paid off Richard's college debts, cheered at his graduations, and told him he was a good man. I walked over to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn. The rain had stopped, leaving the world looking bruised and washed out. Thomas, I thought, looking up at the gray sky. You knew all of this, and you left me the matches to burn it all down. I walked back to the desk, righted the chair, and sat back down. I pulled a fresh legal pad from the drawer and picked up a pen. I had 3 days until Friday. 3 days until Richard brought his crooked doctor to my house to declare me legally incompetent. If they wanted a helpless, confused old woman, I was going to give them the performance of a lifetime. That Sunday, I invited Richard and Brittany over for a family dinner. I spent the afternoon meticulously preparing my costume. I chose a cardigan that was slightly frayed at the cuffs. I deliberately buttoned my blouse off by one hole, so the collar sat unevenly against my neck. I skipped my usual foundation and lipstick, letting the exhaustion and age show fully on my face. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders slump. I shuffled to the door, pasting a vague, slightly bewildered smile on my face. "Mom?" Richard said as I opened the door. He was wearing casual khakis and a polo, holding a bottle of cheap grocery store wine, a far cry from the $200 Cabernets he used to bring when his father was alive. "How are you holding up?" "Oh, Richie," I said, my voice trembling slightly. I hadn't called him Richie since he was 12. Come in, It's just a lot of space in here without your father." Brittany stepped inside, her eyes immediately scanning the foyer as if she were mentally tagging the antique vases for an estate sale. "Hi, Maggie," she said, offering a tight, obligatory hug. She smelled like expensive perfume and secrets. You look tired. I haven't been sleeping well, I murmured, leading them into the dining room. I had intentionally ruined the dinner. The roast chicken was dry as sawdust, and I had accidentally used salt instead of sugar in the sweet potato casserole. We sat at the long dining table. I watched them pick at the terrible food. Richard exchanged a meaningful, triumphant glance with Brittany across the table. They thought it was working. They thought my mind was already slipping. "So, Mom," Richard began, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the table. He put on a voice dripping with fake, cloying sympathy. "Brittany and I have been talking. We're really worried about you being all alone in this massive house. The stairs, the upkeep. It's too much for you now." "Too much?" I asked, looking down at my hands, letting them tremble against the linen napkin. "But this is my home. Thomas and I picked out this wallpaper." "We know, Maggie," Brittany chimed in, reaching over to pat my hand condescendingly. Her skin felt like ice. "But you have to be practical. You forgot to put sugar in the casserole today. What if you forget to turn off the stove tomorrow? We just want you to be safe." I want you to be safe. The lie was so foul I could practically taste it in the back of my throat. I looked at the woman who was planning to run off with her husband's destroyer, lecturing me on safety. "I don't know," I whispered, staring blankly at the wall. "My mind just feels so foggy lately. I couldn't even remember the code to the security alarm this morning." Richard's eyes lit up with predatory excitement. "See? That's exactly what I mean, Mom. Listen, I have a friend, a wonderful doctor. Dr. Evans. I'd love for him to come by on Friday just to have a chat with you, give you a basic checkup, make sure your memory is okay." "A doctor?" I asked, widening my eyes in feigned anxiety. "But I don't want to go to a hospital, Richie." No hospital," Richard promised, giving me a reassuring smile that made me want to slap him across his perfectly shaved jaw. "He'll come right here to the house. Just a friendly conversation. And depending on what he says, we can look at some beautiful assisted living communities. Places where you'll have friends, activities, and around-the-clock care." "Like Sunset Manor?" I asked innocently. Both of them froze. Richard swallowed hard. How do you know about Sunset Manor, Mom?" "Oh, I think I saw a commercial for it on the television," I lied seamlessly, blinking at him. "It looked nice." Richard let out a breath, relaxing back into his chair. "Yes, exactly like Sunset Manor. It's a wonderful place. We'll get the doctor here on Friday and we'll get everything sorted out. You won't have to worry about a single thing anymore, Mom. I'm going to take care of everything." "Thank you, Richard," I said softly, giving him a fragile, loving smile. I looked at my son and then at his treacherous wife. I felt a sudden, profound calm wash over me. The grief was entirely gone. "I'll be ready for the doctor on Friday," I promised them. "And I'll be ready for you, too," I thought, looking down at my water glass so they wouldn't see the absolute, terrifying clarity in my eyes. "You want to take my house?" "I am going to take your entire world." Friday morning arrived with brilliant, mocking sunshine. The skies over Atlanta were a piercing, cloudless blue, entirely at odds with the execution I was about to perform in my living room. I did not wear the frayed cardigan. I did not leave my blouse misbuttoned. I went to the back of my cedar closet and pulled out a deep navy St. John knit suit, the one I used to wear to the annual Vance Corporation board galas. I pinned my hair back in a severe, elegant twist. I applied my makeup with the steady precision of a surgeon, finishing with a coat of deep crimson lipstick. I clasped my mother's authentic pearl necklace around my throat. When I looked in the hallway mirror, the frail, confused widow from Sunday dinner was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of 40 years of corporate warfare. I looked like money. I looked like power. At exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell chimed. I walked slowly to the foyer, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I pulled the heavy mahogany door open. Richard stood on the porch, holding a sleek leather folio. Brittany was beside him, wearing oversized designer sunglasses and tapping her foot impatiently. Slightly behind them stood a man in his late 50s, wearing a tweed jacket and carrying a medical bag. He had the slick, overly tanned face of a man who spent more time on the golf course than in a clinic. "Dr. Evans." "Mom," Richard said, his fake smile freezing for a fraction of a second as his eyes swept over my immaculate appearance. "You look very put together today." "I have guests, Richard," I said smoothly, stepping back to let them in. "I always dress for company. Please come into the formal living room." The formal living room was a massive space with cathedral ceilings, dominated by a huge stone fireplace. Above the mantel was an 85-inch flat-screen television, currently turned off. I had spent the morning connecting my laptop, hidden discreetly inside a decorative cabinet, to the screen. My cell phone, synced as the remote control, was resting quietly in the pocket of my blazer. I sat in the high-backed wing chair at the head of the arrangement. Richard and Brittany took the cream-colored sofa opposite me, while Dr. Evans pulled up a smaller chair, placing his medical bag on the glass coffee table. "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Evans began, folding his hands over his knee. He used the slow, exaggerated tone one might use to address a dim-witted toddler. "Richard tells me you've been having a little trouble with your memory lately, misplacing things, feeling a bit confused about your finances." "Is that what Richard tells you?" I asked, looking pleasantly at my son. "We're just worried, Mom," Richard lied effortlessly, leaning forward. "This house is too much for you. We want to make sure you're protected." "Doctor?" Evans pulled a thick stack of papers from his folio. "Mrs. Vance, I'm going to ask you a few simple questions. Can you tell me what day of the week it is, and perhaps the name of the current president?" I let the silence stretch. I looked at the three of them. I let them sit in the quiet until the air in the room grew thick and uncomfortable. Brittany shifted her weight, checking her Apple Watch. "I can tell you the date, Doctor." "Evans," I finally said, my voice dropping the fragile, wavering act completely. It rang out clear and cold. "I can also tell you that your medical license was suspended in 2018 for writing fraudulent oxycodone prescriptions, and that Richard transferred $10,000 from a Vance Corporation subsidiary account into your Cayman Islands shell company exactly 48 hours ago." Dr. Evans' patronizing smile vanished instantly. The blood drained from his face, leaving his spray tan looking sallow and unnatural. He dropped the pen he was holding. It clattered loudly against the glass coffee table. Richard sat bolt upright. "Mom, what the hell are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your safety, Richard," I said, slipping my hand into my pocket and pressing the button on my phone. The massive screen above the fireplace flashed to life. It wasn't a television show. It was the Vance Corporation internal dashboard, and in the center of the screen, in massive, undeniable text, was the transcript of the encrypted messages between Brittany and Marcus from Apex Capital. "Let's talk about memory," I continued, my eyes fixed on my daughter-in-law. Brittany was staring at the screen, her mouth hanging slightly open, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it was almost beautiful. "Brittany, my memory is so sharp. I can recall the exact message you sent to Marcus 3 weeks before my husband died. Shall I read it aloud?" I didn't wait for her to answer. I hit the audio file. The living room filled with Brittany's purring, malicious voice. "I can't wait. I'm so tired of this fake suburban wife routine. As soon as the ink dries on the bankruptcy, I'm filing for divorce. I'll take my half of whatever Rick manages to hide, plus your payout, and we are on a beach in St. Bart's by Christmas. Miss your hands on me." The recording clicked off. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Richard turned his head slowly, mechanically, to look at his wife. The look of confusion on his face morphed into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. "Brittany?" he whispered. "What? Who is Marcus? Apex? You're talking to Apex Capital?" Brittany scrambled backward on the sofa, pressing herself into the cushions away from her husband. "Rick, it's not what it looks like. It's an AI fake. She made it up. Your mother is crazy, remember? We're here because she's crazy." "I don't need a medical proxy, Brittany," I said, standing up slowly. I walked over to the coffee table and picked up the fraudulent Alzheimer's paperwork Dr. Evans had brought. I tore it slowly, deliberately, down the middle, and let the pieces flutter to the rug. "But you are going to need a very good divorce lawyer, because you aren't getting half of anything." Richard stood up, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. He looked at me, his eyes pleading. In that moment, he still thought I was his ally. He thought I had uncovered his wife's betrayal to protect him. "Mom," Richard said, his voice breaking. "She sold me out to the Vulture Fund. Apex is the company I took a loan from. They're trying to bankrupt Vance Corp. She was helping them." "I know, Richard," I said, my voice devoid of any maternal warmth. "I know about the loan. I know you mortgaged your father's company to cover the $40 million you lost on those disastrous strip malls in Nevada. I know you've been siphoning the employee pension fund to make the minimum interest payments." Richard stumbled back a step, as if I had physically struck him. How do you have access to the internal ledgers? Because, I said, pressing another button on my phone. The screen changed, displaying the notarized, irrefutable documents of the irrevocable family trust. Thomas left me the keys to the kingdom. Richard stared at the screen. He was a businessman. It only took his brain a few seconds to process the legal jargon, to see the dates, to see my signature as the sole beneficiary and owner of the holding company. The trust, Richard breathed, the realization hitting him like a freight train. Dad didn't leave the company to me. The $30 million was an illusion, I finished for him. A sandbox for you to play in. You don't own Vance Corporation, Richard. You never did. Which means the collateral agreement you signed with Apex Capital is fraudulent. You committed federal wire fraud. You pledged assets you do not own to a private equity firm. Dr. Evans had heard enough. Sweating profusely, he grabbed his medical bag. I was deceived, he stammered, backing toward the foyer. I was told this was a routine evaluation. I'm leaving. Run along, doctor, I said without looking at him. And if I ever see your face near my property again, I will personally hand the transaction records of your Cayman account to the IRS. Consider the $10,000 a parting gift. The front door opened and slammed shut. The doctor was gone. I turned my attention back to the sofa. Brittany was crying now, ugly, mascara-streaking tears. She reached out for Richard's arm. Ricky, please, baby, listen to me. Marcus manipulated me. Richard violently shoved her hand away. Don't touch me. You were going to let them bankrupt the company. You were going to leave me. You bankrupted the company yourself, Richard, Brittany screamed, dropping the tearful victim act, her true, venomous nature snapping to the surface. You're a failure. You lost everything. We're about to lose the house, the country club. I'm not going down with a sinking ship. You aren't going anywhere but out the front door, I interrupted, my voice cutting through their screaming match like a blade. Brittany whipped her head toward me, her eyes flashing with pure hatred. You miserable old witch. You think you've won? Rick is going to prison for fraud, and Apex will still sue you into the ground for breach of contract. I walked slowly around the coffee table until I was standing directly over her. I looked down at her terrified, hateful face. Apex Capital has no legal standing, Brittany, I said softly. The contract is void. Vance Corporation is perfectly safe under the umbrella of the trust. As for you, I pulled my phone out of my pocket and tapped the screen. I just remotely deactivated the Vance Corporation black card in your purse. I also froze the joint checking accounts. You have absolutely nothing. Brittany gasped, digging frantically into her designer handbag, pulling out her phone. She stared at her banking app, the screen glowing red with access denied notifications. Get out of my house, I commanded. I don't have anywhere to go, she shrieked. My car is in Rick's name. Then I suggest you start walking, I said, pointing toward the foyer. And leave the Birkin bag on the table. Thomas bought that with company funds for your anniversary. It belongs to the trust. For a moment, I thought she was going to lunge at me. She vibrated with rage, her hands curled into claws. But she looked at my face, and she looked at Richard, who was staring at the floor, completely broken. She realized she had absolutely no leverage left. With a hysterical sob, Brittany dropped the $60,000 handbag onto the rug, turned on her heel, and ran out of the house. The heavy front door clicked shut. It was just Richard and me. My eldest son sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook as he wept. It was a pathetic, gasping sound. A week ago, this sight would have shattered my heart. I would have rushed to him, wrapped my arms around him, and promised to fix whatever was broken. But I wasn't the woman I was a week ago. I had heard him call me an old woman who wouldn't know she was being locked in a sterile warehouse to die. I reached into the decorative cabinet and pulled out a fresh manila folder. I dropped it onto the glass coffee table with a heavy thud. Richard looked up, his eyes red and swollen. What's that? He choked out. That, I said, sitting back down in my wing chair and crossing my legs, is a full, legally binding confession. It details every illegal transfer, every embezzled dollar, and the fraudulent loan agreement you signed with Apex Capital. Richard stared at the folder as if it were a venomous snake. Mom, if I sign that, I'm ruined. You're my mother. Please, you can't send me to prison. I have no intention of sending you to prison, Richard. That would be a public scandal, and it would damage the Vance Corporation brand. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. But you are going to sign it, and I am going to keep it in a very safe place. It is my insurance policy. Insurance for what? For your complete and unconditional surrender, I told him. You are officially terminated as CEO. You will transfer whatever remaining personal assets you have to the family trust to begin paying back the pension fund you stole from. You will give up the country club, the luxury cars, and the tailored suits. Richard looked at me, horrified. Mom, I'll have nothing. How am I supposed to live? You are going to work, I said, my voice hardening into steel. I have arranged a job for you. Vance Corporation owns a subsidiary construction firm that handles commercial concrete pouring. You start on Monday at 6 in the morning. You will carry bags of cement. You will sweat in the Georgia sun. You will earn minimum wage, and every cent over your basic living expenses will go toward your debt. I can't do manual labor, he protested, panic rising in his throat. I'm a CEO. I have an MBA from Wharton. You're a thief, Richard, I corrected him flatly. And you are a coward who tried to throw his own mother into a nursing home to hide his failures. So you have a choice. You can sign the confession, put on a hard hat on Monday, and learn what honest work actually feels like. Or you can walk out that door, and I will email the contents of this USB drive to the local FBI field office in exactly 5 minutes. I unclipped a silver pen from the folder and tossed it onto the glass table. It rolled and stopped against the edge of the confession document. Your call. Richard looked at the pen. He looked at the massive screen above the fireplace, where the irrefutable evidence of his crimes was still glowing brightly. He realized the terrifying truth. The mother he had underestimated his entire life held his absolute destruction in the palm of her hand, and she wasn't bluffing. With a shaking, trembling hand, Richard picked up the pen. He opened the folder, didn't even bother reading the pages, and scrawled his signature on the bottom line. He closed the folder and pushed it across the glass. He didn't look at me. He looked utterly defeated, a hollowed-out shell of the arrogant man who had walked into my house an hour ago. Go, I said quietly. Richard stood up. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just shuffled out of the living room, his posture slumped, looking 10 years older than when he arrived. I sat alone in the quiet living room. The afternoon sun was casting long golden shadows across the expensive rug. I looked at the signed confession, the abandoned Birkin bag, the torn pieces of the fraudulent medical proxy. I had won. I had protected my home, saved my husband's legacy, and exacted a flawless, bloodless revenge on the son who had tried to bury me alive. But as the adrenaline slowly began to fade, a heavy, dark realization settled over my shoulders. The victory wasn't complete. Richard's financial records had revealed the disaster of Vance Corporation, but my review of Thomas's private files the night before had revealed something else, something far more dangerous. My youngest son, Harrison, hadn't just squandered his trust fund. He was tangled up in a nightmare that involved local cartels, a $500,000 debt, and a secret from 5 years ago that threatened to blow this family apart all over again. I picked up the signed confession and locked it in the cabinet. I walked to the foyer, grabbed my keys, and walked out the front door into the bright afternoon sun. The Queen had reclaimed her throne, but it was time to descend into the gutter to find her youngest son. The drive from the manicured lawns of Buckhead to the decaying industrial underbelly of South Atlanta took less than 40 minutes, but it felt like crossing into a different dimension. My silver Mercedes glided past boarded-up storefronts, chain-link fences choked with weeds, and street corners where desperate-looking men watched my car with predatory eyes. I didn't lock my doors. I wasn't afraid. After the morning I had just survived, a bad neighborhood in Atlanta was the least of my concerns. I pulled up to a dilapidated brick apartment building. The address Thomas had logged in his private investigator's file was Unit 4B. The hallway smelled of stale cigarette smoke, boiling cabbage, and something sour I didn't want to identify. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered violently, buzzing like angry wasps. I stood before the battered wooden door of 4B and knocked sharply. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time, the knuckles of my St. John suit catching on the splintered wood. "Harrison, open this door. It's your mother." I heard a muffled curse inside, followed by the sound of deadbolts sliding back. The door cracked open, held by a heavy chain. A bloodshot blue eye peered out at me from the shadows. Mom? Harrison's voice was a ragged croak. What are you doing here? You can't be here. You need to leave right now. Take the chain off the door, Harrison, I commanded, projecting every ounce of maternal authority I possessed. Before I call a locksmith to drill it out. The door shut, the chain rattled, and it swung wide open. I stepped into the apartment, and it took everything in me not to weep. It was a squalid, dark box. Trash littered the stained carpet. Fast food wrappers were piled on a broken coffee table, and the windows were covered with heavy, duct-taped garbage bags to block out the sun. And then I looked at my youngest son. Harrison was 35, but he looked 50. He was terrifyingly thin, his collarbones protruding sharply against a stained gray t-shirt. His hair was greasy and matted, his hands trembled constantly, and there were dark, bruised bags under his eyes. He looked like a cornered, beaten animal. I told you to leave, Harrison muttered, pacing frantically across the small room, rubbing his face. They watch this place. If they see a car like yours parked out front, they're going to think I have money. They're going to come up here. Who is going to come up here, Harry? I asked, keeping my voice surprisingly gentle. The people I owe, he snapped, a hysterical edge to his voice. $500,000, Mom. I owe them $500,000 by midnight on Sunday, or they are going to put a bullet in my kneecaps, and then my head. Dad's will gave me those commercial properties, but they're tied up in probate. I can't sell them fast enough. I'm a dead man. I walked over to the filthy sofa and sat down, smoothing my skirt. I pulled the printed ledger from Thomas's USB drive out of my purse and laid it on the coffee table. I know about the debt, Harrison, I said quietly. Your father knew too. He had private investigators tracking you for the last 2 years of his life. I know you owe $500,000 to the East Side Syndicate. Harrison stopped pacing. He stared at the documents, his chest heaving. Dad knew? And he just left me out here to die? No, I corrected him. He left the family trust to me, and he left me the power to save you. I can pay the syndicate. I can make a wire transfer in 5 minutes and wipe this slate clean. Harrison's knees buckled. He dropped to the floor, burying his face in his hands, letting out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. Oh God. Mom, please, I swear I'll get clean. I'll go to rehab, I just don't want to die. I looked down at him, my heart aching with a fierce, protective instinct. But I couldn't let my guard down yet. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. I will pay it, Harry. On one condition, I said, my tone turning sharp. You tell me the truth. He looked up, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. What truth? I'm a junkie, Mom. I owe drug dealers money. That's the truth. Don't lie to me, I snapped, leaning forward. I was the bookkeeper for Vance Corporation for 20 years. I know how to track money. $500,000 isn't a drug debt, Harrison. A street-level addict doesn't get a $500,000 line of credit from a violent syndicate. They would have killed you at $50,000. This isn't a drug debt. This is extortion. Harrison froze, the color completely drained from his already pale face. He looked at me with a terror that went far deeper than his fear of the gang. Who is blackmailing you, Harrison? I demanded. And for what? He violently shook his head, scrambling backward on the floor until his back hit the wall. I can't. Mom, if I tell you, it destroys everything. It destroys the company. It destroys Rick. Dad made me swear on his life. I can't. The mention of Richard made my blood freeze. Richard is already destroyed, I said coldly. He mortgaged the company to a vulture fund and tried to put me in a nursing home this morning. I stripped him of his CEO title 2 hours ago. Whatever you are protecting him from, it's over. Tell me the truth, Harrison. Now. Harrison stared at me, his jaw trembling. He looked like a little boy lost in the dark. Slowly, agonizingly, the dam broke. It was 5 years ago, he whispered, his voice hoarse. The night of the corporate Christmas gala. It was raining. I remembered that night. I had stayed home with a terrible migraine. Thomas and Richard had gone to the gala. Harrison, who was 30 at the time and already struggling with depression, had stayed at his own apartment. Rick was driving home, Harrison continued, wrapping his arms around his knees. He was drunk, blackout drunk. He took the back roads through Buckhead to avoid the cops. He was speeding, and the roads were slick. Harrison squeezed his eyes shut, as if trying to block out a memory. He hit a kid, Mom, a 19-year-old college student walking on the shoulder. Rick panicked. He drove away. A hit and run. The air in the room vanished. My hands gripped the edge of the coffee table so hard my knuckles turned stark white. Richard killed a child? Rick drove straight to Dad's house, Harrison sobbed, the words tumbling out of him now in a desperate rush. Dad called me at 2 a.m. He told me to come over. When I got there, Rick was covered in blood, throwing up in the bushes. The front of the Lexus was smashed in. And your father called the police, I whispered, praying to a God I wasn't sure was listening. No, Harrison cried, slamming his fist against his forehead. No. Dad said Vance Corporation was about to go public. He said if the CEO was arrested for vehicular manslaughter, the stock would tank, the banks would pull our loans, and thousands of people would lose their jobs. The family would be ruined. I felt physically sick. The room began to spin. Dad looked at me, Mom, Harrison choked out. He looked at me and he said, Harrison, Rick is the future of this company. You don't have a career. You don't have a family. You have nothing to lose. Save your brother. Save our legacy. The horrifying reality crashed over me like a tidal wave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. Dad gave me the keys to the Lexus, Harrison whispered into the silence. He told me to drive it 3 miles down the road, call 911 and say I fell asleep at the wheel. So I did. I took the fall. I went to a state penitentiary for 3 years for vehicular manslaughter so Rick could wear his custom suits and pretend to be a king. Tears streamed down my face, hot and fast. My youngest son, my sensitive, quiet boy. His own father had thrown him to the wolves to protect a corporate balance sheet. Prison broke me, Mom, Harrison wept. It was hell. I started using Inside just to numb the panic attacks. But the East Side Syndicate ran the cell block. They found out who I was. They found out I was a Vance. And they knew the police report didn't make sense. The seat was adjusted for someone 6 inches taller than me. They figured it out. The blackmail, I breathed. They protected me inside for a price, Harrison nodded, shivering. When I got out, the price went up. $500,000 for their silence. If I don't pay, they go to the DA with the evidence that Rick was the driver, and I go back to prison for perjury and obstruction. Dad paid them off for 2 years to keep it quiet. But when Dad died, the payments stopped. Rick didn't know about the blackmail. He thought I just went to jail for him. He cut off my allowance. I sat in the squalid darkness of the apartment, the weight of my husband's sins pressing down on me so heavily I thought my ribs would crack. Thomas hadn't just been an absent husband. He was a monster. He had sacrificed our youngest son on the altar of his own greed. He had let Harrison rot in a cell, let him become an addict, all to save the golden child who ended up destroying the company anyway. A fierce, blinding rage ignited in my chest. It burned away the shock. It burned away the grief. I stood up. I walked over to my son, knelt on the filthy carpet, and pulled him into my arms. He smelled like sweat and decay, but I didn't care. I held him as tightly as I could, rocking him back and forth as he sobbed into my shoulder. I'm so sorry, Harry, I whispered fiercely into his matted hair. I am so sorry I didn't see it. I'm sorry I let him do this to you. I'm scared, Mom, he cried. Don't be, I said, my voice hardening into absolute unyielding steel. You are never going back to that prison, and you are never giving those animals another dime. I pulled back, taking his face in my hands. Get your coat. You are coming home with me. I am putting you in a private detox facility tonight, under a fake name. They won't find you. But the debt, he panicked. Mom, they'll leak the truth. They'll go after Rick. Let them, I said coldly. Richard deserves to face the consequences of his actions, but I don't think the syndicate is going to the police, because I know exactly who is pulling their strings. Harrison looked confused. What do you mean? I stood up, walking over to the coffee table and picking up the ledger from the USB drive. While Harrison had been confessing, my mind, trained in corporate accounting, had been connecting the dots. You said Dad paid the blackmail for 2 years, I explained, flipping to a specific page in the ledger. I found these wire transfers last night. $50,000 a month to a shell company called Meridian Holdings. I thought it was a bad investment, but it was the payoff to the syndicate. So, I continued, my eyes narrowing at the paper. I ran a background check on Meridian Holdings this morning. Do you know who owns the parent company that controls Meridian? Harrison shook his head. Apex Capital Partners, I said, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. Harrison stared at me, his mind struggling to keep up. Wait, Apex? Isn't that the vulture fund that Rick borrowed money from? Yes, I said, the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle locking into place. Think about it, Harrison. Apex Capital gives Richard a predatory loan to bankrupt the company from the top. At the exact same time, Apex Capital secretly owns the gang extorting you from the bottom, bleeding your father dry, and keeping the family terrified. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't just bad luck. This was a highly coordinated multi-million-dollar siege. Someone is hunting our family, Harry, I said softly, staring at the documents. Someone who knew about the hit and run. Someone who knew exactly how to exploit Richard's arrogance and your father's pride. Who? Harrison asked, his voice trembling. A name floated up from the deepest, darkest recesses of my memory. A name from 40 years ago, back when Thomas and I were just starting out. A man Thomas had ruthlessly crushed in a real estate deal to secure the seed money for Vance Corporation. A man who swore he would return to take everything Thomas loved. Arthur Sterling, I whispered. Arthur Sterling was the billionaire phantom of Atlanta real estate. He operated in the shadows, using private equity firms and shell companies to destroy his rivals. He had waited 40 years. He had waited for Thomas to grow old and complacent. He had used my own sons to tear the empire down from the inside. He thought he had won. He thought Thomas was dead. Richard was disgraced. Harrison was a junkie, and I was just a senile old widow on her way to a nursing home. He had no idea that the real architect of Vance Corporation had just taken the wheel. Come on, Harry, I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. We are going home, and then I am going to war. I didn't sleep that night. While Harrison tossed and turned in the guest bedroom, sweating through the first agonizing hours of his detox, I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop, a pot of black coffee, and a phone. I was no longer just a mother trying to discipline her greedy children. I was a CEO protecting her empire from a hostile takeover. By 4 a.m, I had compiled every piece of evidence from the USB drive, the fraudulent wire transfers to Dr. Evans, the encrypted messages between Brittany and Apex Capital, the blackmail payments to the East Side Syndicate, and the shell company ownership records proving Arthur Sterling was the puppet master. At 6 a.m., I made a phone call to a man named Robert Hughes. Robert was a senior special agent with the FBI's white-collar crime division in Atlanta. He had also been Thomas's regular golf partner for 20 years. Maggie? Robert answered, his voice thick with sleep. It's 6 a.m. Is everything okay? No, Robert, I said, my voice steady and cold. Everything is terribly wrong, but I have a file I need you to look at. It involves federal wire fraud, extortion, and a massive RICO violation orchestrated by Arthur Sterling, and it's happening inside Vance Corporation today. The silence on the other end lasted for 3 seconds. When Robert spoke again, he sounded wide awake. I'll be at your house in 20 minutes. At 1 p.m., I walked through the sliding glass doors of the Vance Corporation headquarters. I was wearing the same St. John suit from the day before, but I felt different. The armor had fully fused to my skin. I bypassed the reception desk, ignoring the frantic calls of the security guard. I knew exactly where I was going. The executive boardroom was on the 40th floor. As I approached the heavy double doors, I could hear voices inside. I didn't knock. I pushed the doors open with both hands. The room froze. Richard was sitting at the head of the table, looking like a man walking to the gallows. Across from him sat Marcus, the sleazy director from Apex Capital, and standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city with a smug, triumphant smile, was an older man with silver hair and a sharp, tailored suit. Arthur Sterling. What is the meaning of this? Marcus snapped, standing up. This is a closed executive meeting. Mom? Richard croaked, his eyes darting between me and the men. What are you doing here? You're supposed to be at home. I am the owner of this building, Richard, I said, walking slowly to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table. I can go wherever I please. Arthur Sterling turned away from the window. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. He hadn't seen me in 40 years, but he recognized me. Margaret Vance, he said, his voice smooth like oiled glass. My condolences on Thomas. It's a shame he couldn't be here to see the culmination of his life's work. Cut the act, Arthur, I said, dropping my leather briefcase onto the mahogany table. I know exactly who you are, and I know exactly what you've done. Sterling chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He walked over to the table and tapped a thick stack of legal documents resting in front of Richard. What I have done, Margaret, is offer a lifeline to a sinking ship. Your son, in his infinite wisdom, borrowed $40 million from my firm. He defaulted. Today, he is signing Vance Corporation over to Apex Capital to satisfy the debt. It's just business. It's not just business, I corrected him. It's a 40-year grudge. You used a vulture fund to bankrupt my eldest son, and you used the East Side Syndicate to blackmail my youngest. You bled my husband dry for 2 years, $50,000 a month, threatening to send Harrison back to prison for a hit-and-run Richard committed. Richard's head snapped up. He looked at me, his face twisting in absolute shock. Harrison! The blackmail! What are you talking about? Harrison didn't cause that accident 5 years ago, Richard, I said, not taking my eyes off Sterling. You did. You were drunk. Your father forced Harrison to take the fall to protect the company, and Arthur Sterling found out about it. Richard slumped back in his chair, all the air leaving his lungs. The reality of what his father had done, what his brother had suffered, and how thoroughly he had been played, finally crushed the last remaining ounces of his arrogance. Sterling's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold, calculating annoyance. A fascinating story, Margaret. Truly, but it doesn't change the ink on the paper. Richard is the CEO. He signed the collateral agreement. Vance Corporation belongs to me. No, Arthur, I said softly, opening my briefcase. It doesn't. I pulled out the documents for the irrevocable family trust and slid them down the long table. They came to a stop right in front of Marcus. You should really have your legal team do a better title search, I told the Apex director. Richard isn't the owner of Vance Corporation. He never has been. The company is owned by a family trust. I am the sole trustee and beneficiary. Therefore, the collateral agreement Richard signed to secure your loan is fraudulent, illegal, and completely void. Marcus stared at the documents, his face turning the color of wet ash. He looked up at Sterling, panic in his eyes. Mr. Sterling, she's right. The signature is Thomas Vance, but the holding company is in her name. We don't have a claim. Sterling's composure finally broke. His face flushed dark red. He slammed his fist onto the table. You think a piece of paper is going to stop me? I'll drag you through litigation for a decade. I'll bleed you until you have to sell this building just to pay your lawyers. You aren't going to have time for litigation, Arthur, I said, checking my watch. Right on cue, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open again. Special Agent Robert Hughes walked in, followed by 4 federal agents in dark windbreakers. Arthur Sterling, Robert said, his voice echoing in the large room. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit extortion, wire fraud, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Sterling froze, staring at the FBI agents. For the first time in 40 years, the phantom billionaire looked completely powerless. On what grounds? He spat. On the grounds of $50,000 a month wired to a shell company you control, directly linked to an organized crime syndicate, Robert replied, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Mrs. Vance provided the ledgers this morning. We've already raided the East Side Syndicate's warehouse. They were very eager to trade the name of their boss for lighter sentences. The agents moved in. They pulled Sterling's arms behind his back, the metallic click of the handcuffs sounding incredibly loud in the quiet room. Marcus was also detained, stammering protests as he was led away. As they walked Sterling past me, he stopped. He looked at me, a mixture of pure hatred and genuine disbelief in his eyes. Thomas was a fool, he hissed. He never told me his wife was the real shark. Thomas was a lot of things, I replied evenly, but he was right about one thing. You underestimated me. They let him out. The boardroom was quiet again. I looked down at the other end of the table. Richard was still sitting there. He looked completely destroyed. His company was gone. His wife had betrayed him. He realized his father had used him, and his brother had gone to prison for him. Mom, Richard whispered, fresh tears spilling down his cheeks. I didn't know. I swear to God, I didn't know about Harrison. I thought I was protecting the family. You were protecting your ego, Richard, I said, packing my briefcase. But the truth is out now. Are they going to arrest me? He asked, his voice trembling. No, I said. I gave the FBI the ledgers concerning the blackmail. I withheld the signed confession regarding your embezzlement. But the deal we made yesterday still stands. You start at the concrete subsidiary on Monday. You are going to work your way out of this, Richard. Sweat and calluses. It's the only way you'll ever figure out what kind of man you actually are. I picked up my briefcase and walked out of the room, leaving the broken CEO sitting alone at the head of the table. That evening, the Buckhead house was quiet. Harrison was asleep upstairs, exhausted from his first day of detox. I sat at Thomas's desk, the desk that was now mine. The empire was secure. The threat was neutralized. But there was one last thing I needed to do. On the USB drive, there was a final file. It wasn't a ledger or an audio recording. It was a video file, titled simply For Maggie. I clicked it. The screen flickered and there was Thomas. He looked incredibly sick. The video must have been recorded just weeks before his heart gave out. He was sitting in this very office, looking directly into the camera. "Hi, Maggie," he said, his voice raspy. "If you're watching this, it means you found the box. It means you figured it out. And knowing you, it means you probably just saved our family." He looked down at his hands, rubbing his knuckles. "I was a coward, Maggie, my whole life. I built this massive company. I wore the expensive suits. I let everyone call me a genius. But I always knew the truth. You were the genius. You were the one who balanced the books when we had nothing. You were the one who saw the angles I missed." Tears blurred my vision. I touched the screen, my fingers tracing the lines on his tired face. "When Rick hit that boy, I panicked," Thomas confessed, his voice breaking. "I chose the company over my sons. I sacrificed Harrison because I thought Rick was the only one who could keep the Vance name alive. I was so wrong. I broke our boys, Maggie. I raised them with money, but I didn't teach them how to be men." He looked back up at the camera, and his eyes were filled with profound regret. "I couldn't tell you the truth. If I told you what I did to Harrison, you would have left me, and I couldn't survive without you, so I lived with the poison. And when Sterling started blackmailing us, I knew it was the end. I couldn't beat him, but I knew someone who could." Thomas offered a weak, sad smile. "I left you the empty box, Maggie, because I needed you to get angry. I needed you to wake up from the quiet life I forced you into. I needed you to see Rick and Brittany for who they really were, without my protection shielding them. I needed the matriarch to take over." He took a deep, shuddering breath. "I'm sorry for the humiliation. I'm sorry for the pain. But I leave you the throne, my love. It was always yours anyway. Rule it well. Save our boys. And please, somewhere in that massive heart of yours, try to forgive me." The screen went black. I sat in the dark office, the silence wrapping around me like a blanket. I didn't feel angry anymore. I just felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "I forgive you, Tommy," I whispered into the dark, "and I'll take it from here." 1 year later, the ballroom of the Atlanta Ritz-Carlton was packed with over 500 guests. Flashbulbs popped and the low hum of excited chatter filled the air. I stood in front of a massive vanity mirror in the green room, adjusting the collar of my bespoke cream-colored suit. I was 69 years old. My hair was a striking, natural silver, cut in a sharp bob. I wore no jewelry except for my mother's pearl necklace. There was a knock on the door, and Harrison walked in. He looked entirely different from the broken man in that squalid apartment. He had gained 30 pounds, his eyes were clear and bright, and he was wearing a sharp tuxedo. He had been clean for exactly 365 days. "You ready, Madam Chairwoman?" he asked, a warm smile spreading across his face. "I am," I said, turning to face him. "Is your brother out there?" Harrison nodded. "Yeah, he's sitting at the back table. He's got calluses on his hands the size of quarters, Mom. But he looks calm. He said to tell you he finished the foundation on the new downtown project yesterday." I smiled. Richard had spent the last year carrying bags of cement. He was divorced, living in a modest apartment and driving a used Ford. But for the first time in his life, he was earning his sleep. "Let's go," I said, taking Harrison's arm. We walked out into the ballroom. As we approached the stage, the crowd rose to their feet, bursting into applause. This wasn't a Vance Corporation gala. This was the inaugural dinner for the Margaret Vance Foundation for Senior Women's Independence. After liquidating several of Vance Corporation's underperforming assets, I had taken $30 million, the exact amount Richard thought he had inherited, and poured it into an endowment. The foundation provided legal aid, housing assistance, and small business grants for older women who had been abandoned by their families, financially abused, or left destitute after the death of a spouse. I walked up the stairs to the podium. The applause slowly died down. I looked out over the sea of faces. I saw powerful politicians, wealthy investors, but most importantly, I saw dozens of older women in the front rows, women with gray hair and lined faces, women who had spent their lives being invisible. "Thank you," I began, my voice clear and strong, echoing through the massive room. A year ago, I was handed a dusty, empty recipe box and told that my life's purpose was over. I was told that because I was a 68-year-old widow, my only option was to fade quietly into the background, to accept the crumbs my family was willing to throw me, to be invisible. I paused, making eye contact with a woman in the front row who was wiping a tear from her cheek. "Society has a terrible habit of discarding women when our hair turns gray," I continued. "They look at our wrinkles and assume our minds have dulled. They look at our quiet sacrifices and assume we are weak. They assume that because we spent decades building the foundations of our families, we don't know how to build empires of our own." I gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward. "They are wrong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "We are the generations of women who stretched pennies during recessions. We are the women who managed the unmanageable, who saw the details the men ignored, who carried the emotional and financial weight of our households without ever asking for a salary or a title. We are not weak. We are forged in steel." I looked toward the back of the room, catching Richard's eye. He gave me a small, respectful nod. "Do not let anyone, not your husbands, not your bosses, and certainly not your children, tell you that your time has passed. The recipe box they give you might look empty, but you have the power to fill it with whatever you choose." I smiled, a fierce, unapologetic smile. "My name is Margaret Vance. I am 69 years old, and I'm just getting started." The ballroom erupted. The standing ovation was deafening. I stood at the podium, bathed in the bright lights, looking out at the empire I had reclaimed, the sons I had saved, and the thousands of women I was going to help. The invisible wife was gone forever. Long live the Queen.